What most beginner sewists don't realize is that you don't need a serger to start your sewing journey. This is something I wish I knew when I just started sewing, so in the next couple of minutes, I'm going to show you 4 different ways that you can finish a raw edge without a serger. I'm going to start with the easiest one and build my way up to the hardest one. I'm going to tell you when to use each of them and how to do them. I'm Gabby from QUAINT, and on this channel, I share sewing tips and tutorials for the guys and girls who want to learn how to sew their own bags and clothes. So if that sounds like your vibe, subscribe and hit the bell icon so that you never miss an upload. Pinking shears were invented in the 1930s before sewing machines had fancy stitching. This is how seamstresses and tailors used to finish raw edges back in the day, and it helped them to go really fast. Fun fact, I bought these pinking shears just for the purpose of recording this video, and I'm actually really excited to use it because I can see myself finishing raw edges that I may not necessarily have the time to serge. Pinking shears is the easiest option because it involves no stitching. You don't have to turn on no extra settings for your sewing machine. You don't have to use no needle and thread, nothing like that. All you need is this right here. I got this for 3,800 Jamaican dollars. This right here has been freshly added to the sewing supplies list. So check that out in the description box down below. It's going to take you to my Amazon storefront. It has a zigzag blade, so when you cut fabric with it, it doesn't fray. Based on the angles that the threads are cut that make up the fabric, that's what causes it not to fray. It's something about the zigzag blades. To use a pair of pinking shears, you're pretty much just going to sew as you would before, and then instead of using a serger or a sewing machine to finish the raw edges, you just go ahead and trim that down with your pinking shears. You can use pinking shears on tightly woven fabrics like cotton poplin, quilting cotton, denim, and linen blends. You don't want to use this on knit fabrics that are loosely woven, or on fabrics that aggressively fray, like rayon challis, silk, and some linens. Yeah. Before sergers became popular, an overcast stitch was the standard finish on garments in the 50s to 70s. It's harder than pinking shears, but it's easier than the other two options because it's a setting that your sewing machine already has. And once you put your machine on that setting and you stitch, it's just going to do it for you. You can use it on almost any woven fabric, but you really don't want to use it on sheer fabrics though. That's going to cause your fabric to ripple, and you definitely don't want to use it on fabrics that have really bulky seams. Same for a serger. To do it, you're going to set your sewing machine to an overcast stitch. On my sewing machine, it looks like this. And by the way, I'm using a Singer 6600C heavy duty. And if you're planning to buy a sewing machine soon and you want 10% off, just use my code on serger.com. A stitch length of 2 to 2.5 and a stitch width of 4 to 5 are ideal. Set your fabric underneath the presser foot so that the needle falls over the edge of it and stitch. You want the thread to hug the edge of the fabric. Bonus points if you use an overcast foot. That's going to make it a lot easier for the thread to wrap around the edge of the fabric. That's because the overcast foot holds the fabric in place at all times. So you don't have to try and figure out how far to put the fabric so that the needle falls over the edge of it. The overcast foot just does that for you. When you're done, bring the hand wheel towards you and just pull the fabric out. When the thread is long enough, you're going to cut the thread right at the fabric right there, and that's it. You're done. If your sewing machine doesn't have an overcast stitch and you want to know what to do, just use a zigzag stitch instead. It doesn't look the same, but it still works. I'm saying this because I know that not every sewing machine has an overcast stitch function. Most of them though have a zigzag stitch, so you definitely can use that if you find that your sewing machine doesn't have an overcast option. French seams were originally used to basically tuck away raw edges because they irritated the skin. But in today's day and age, there are couture houses that use French seams in order to create a luxury finish. Serger stitching can be messy at times, especially if you don't know how to close the loop on the end of your serger. It can get really messy and sometimes it unravels, and overcast stitches can give the same effect. However, when you use a French seam, the raw edges are tucked away. If you're one of those people whose skin is irritated by raw edges, leave that in the comments down below. By the way, just in case you didn't pick it up, I'm Jamaican. If you're Jamaican too, leave a Jamaican flag in the comments down below. But if you're not Jamaican, I still want you to leave your flag down below because I want to know where you're watching from. So French seams are harder than pinking shears and overcast stitch because of the fact that a French seam requires you to do an extra step. And if you forget to add the right seam allowance, you're gonna have a hard time fixing that. You can use a French seam on sheer or lightweight fabrics such as voile, I hope I pronounced that right, chiffon, organza, or whenever you want a nice luxury feel to the inside of your garment. You don't want to use it on thick fabrics because that's going to be too bulky. For example, denim or leatherette. That can easily get bulky because that's several layers right there. You also don't want to use it around curved seams such as armholes, crotches, or princess seams because they need space to spread and flex. Some curved seams need to be clipped in order to make them more flexible. But because a French seam closes the raw edges in, it's impossible to clip into it. And just in case you're not sure what I mean when I say clipping, this is what I'm talking about. Too much bulk in areas like the armhole and the crotch affect the drape of the fabric. And that can make it really hard to wear it and to press it. You're better off just doing an overcast stitch or a bias binding finish on a curved seam. To do a French seam, put the fabric pieces wrong sides together. Put the fabric underneath the presser foot and sew with a straight stitch with a 1/4 inch allowance. Trim it down to about 1/8 of an inch. Then put the fabric pieces right sides together and iron the seam flat. This makes the next step easier. Sew with a 3/8 inch allowance, and that's a little bit less than 1/2 of an inch. When you're done, bring the hand wheel forward again, raise the presser foot and pull the fabric out. Cut the thread at the fabric and that's it. You're gonna make sure that you press the seam again. You should be pressing all your seams actually. High-end menswear uses Hong Kong seams. And that's a variation of a bias binding finish, and they use it because it reinforces the seam while keeping it flexible. This is by far the hardest method, and that's because it requires the most work. Not to mention, there are several different ways that you can do a bias binding finish on a garment. It takes accuracy, patience, and skill. But the results are gorgeous, so the risk is worth the reward. You can use this on jackets and coats that aren't lined, on armholes and seams that can't be serged or overcasted. I'm just gonna call it overcasted. And to add beauty to your project. I have seen some very gorgeous bias binding before, and bias binding can actually become a stitch detail or a design detail in the work that you do. You don't want to use this on very thin fabrics like chiffon, organza, voile, and georgette because that adds bulk, and usually when people use these types of fabrics, they don't want any bulk. You also want to avoid using this on stretchy fabrics because imagine using bias binding that doesn't stretch on fabrics that stretch. You're basically going to hinder the stretch that's in the fabric, so it's just not going to stretch the same way anymore. And that's a very common beginner sewing mistake. If you want to find out the best way to sew stretchy fabrics without using non-stretch thread, check out this video right here. The rule is that the bias binding that you're using is supposed to be lighter than the fabric that you're using it on. There are 3 ways to sew bias binding. And if you want to know how to make your own bias tape, watch this video. You can take the bias tape and wrap it around the edge of the fabric. Pin it in place for extra security and top stitch it to the fabric. This is the quickest way. If you really want to take your time though, you can open the bias tape, align the edge of it with the edge of the fabric and stitch in the fold. Wrap the bias tape around the edge of the fabric and top stitch along the edge. With these two methods, the bias tape is showing, but this third method hides the bias tape. You unfold the bias tape and align it with the edge of the fabric on the right side and stitch in the fold. Then you press the seam and fold the bias tape over to the wrong side, to the point where you're not seeing it on the right side anymore. Top stitch on the edge of the bias tape, and that's it. This is commonly used on necklines and armholes to get a clean finish. I used a regular bias tape finish on this neckline though, and honestly it's my favorite way to finish a neckline, especially when it comes to cotton fabrics. The other two are better used on seams and for decorative purposes. So now you can stop stressing about not having a serger and get on with your sewing journey, because now you know the 4 best ways to finish raw edges without one. This means that your sewing projects can go from looking tacky to looking rich, and I love that for you. But whenever you're ready to get a serger though, I recommend this one right here, and that's if you already have a Singer ecosystem. If you already have a Singer sewing machine, why not just get a Singer serger as well? If you want to get 10% off on their website, just use my code at checkout. I'll see you in the next video.